the government is the plantation owner. The people in the government are essentially the co-owners of that plantation.
And the uppity slaves want to escape.
Right, that's right. And the slaves are essentially getting, the bare sustenance from their slave masters in this case. It's just the plantation structure writ large.
Well, it's not just the bare subsistence level. Here in the United States, we're very wealthy, when you compare us to the rest of the world. But you really have to ask yourself if maybe this is just a better system for controlling slaves. I mean,
it is
right. I think so too. When it came down to owning slaves, you had to send some guy out there with a whip to smack him in the back to keep him going. That you needed to give him clothes, you needed to give him a place to live. This way, when they just suck off between 35 and 60% of your wages, depending on how successful you are at reaping the proverbial cotton. They don't have to do anything to take care of you. You take care of yourself. They don't need to whip you in the back. You whip yourself. You get all this stuff done, and then you cut them big old checks. And I'm not talking about just the federal government. I'm talking about government on all levels. I pay more to the local government than I do to the feds.
Who was it who said that there are none so hopelessly enslaved than those who think they are free?
Indeed.
Oh, boy, who did say that? That is a good one. I don't know. We'll have to figure that out. So anyway, it all worked nicely for the plantation owners, maybe not so much for everyone else on the farm. Ron Paul-style libertarians don't like to acknowledge that much of Jefferson's early thinking was predicated on what worked best for him and his fellow Southerners. It wasn't until Jefferson became president and took responsibility for the entire nation that his thinking evolved a bit.
The king.
Goth.
His thinking evolved.
Gaith.
Because are you talking about the quote? The source of the quote? So he's saying Jefferson's thinking evolved when he took power. Doesn't seem like that to me. If you're using barbarism to get your way, your thinking has not evolved, but devolved.
Yes.
Power goes to your brain in a very devolution-style manner. It is not helping the world to give human beings power over other human beings, and it does not enlighten those individuals. If anything, maybe in retrospect, after they're out of the seats of power, they can look back, like Arnold Schwarzenegger recently did, and realize that they were addicted to it, and they did things that they might not otherwise have done.
Like a real crack addict, when they look back on their life, when they've their addiction life, once they're clean and sober.
Meanwhile, in the northern states, society worked a bit differently. Localities took responsibility to build and operate community hospitals available to anyone who needed help. It was much more an accepted rule of society that those who did well had a charitable obligation to look after those who were not so fortunate, and that charitable assistance often took the form of government-operated programs.
Indeed.
Well, no, charity is not government. Government is not charity. Charity is something that you do upon your own volition because you believe it's the right thing to do. And maybe it is a socially accepted thing. Maybe there is sort of a standard of, to the point where if you're not charitable, you might be ostracized. There can be different societal influences involved in influencing people to become charitable or to be more charitable, but they aren't force. They're not the threat of violence, and that's what government is and has been. Mark, you would argue that it could be something different. It hasn't. Government historically has been a monopoly over violence. And so forcing people to give to this program, whatever it might be, is not charity, and it is not charitable. 1-800-259-9231. That's the SACL CAI toll-free line. You can take control of the airwaves. More about Ron Paul, the alleged financial crack dealer, here in moments, and you can take control as well. 800-259-9231. This is Free Talk Live. All right, as we continue here, Ron Paul, the financial crack dealer, that's what Forbes magazine is calling him, because he is suggesting that people might be able to take care of themselves. And, of course, the conclusion this guy is jumping to is that, well, without the government around, everybody will just hoard their money and no one will take care of anybody else.
Like Scrooge. Like the story of Scrooge gets misinterpreted, and they say, oh, everyone's going to be like Scrooge. But actually, in the story of Scrooge, the townspeople actually eventually persuaded him to become generous on his own volition.
So they didn't put a gun to his head.
Right. They did it through his conscience. And over time, he became more generous on his own without any guns pointed at him.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's how I've become in my life, is that over time, as I've matured, I've realized that some things are more important than others that they used to be, and I give money to charity now that I can afford to give money to charity as well.
Sure, but even if you had a certain percentage of people in a free society who decided not to give to charity, there's still all the rest of the people who give, who make up for it.
Right.
It's everyone's choice.
So if the government were to take care of all charity, and that it would be a disaster if they did, because private charity is so much more efficient than government did, it would still only be a small portion, or at least a portion of what people pay in taxes, all their taxes. So it's the suggestion that everybody needs to give, otherwise the system will fall apart, is ludicrous. Everybody doesn't give now. If you take all the aggregate taxes out there, and I mean local, state, federal, gas, property, whatever, and you add them all together, how much of that is really charity? I would say less than 50%, if not even. I mean, I'm talking about Social Security, include everything that somebody might consider charity. Or
you can't use that word. Charity doesn't apply to government, as I explained earlier. You mean assistance programs?
That somebody might consider a social welfare program, and if you aggregate them all together, it's probably less than 50%. So even if only every other person gave, then you would still be at the numbers. But consider that the government is probably 2 or 3 times as inefficient as private charity. So then you can take that 50% of people, you can cut it down to maybe a third. Yeah. Then you consider the people that don't feel that they have a responsibility to give now because they give to taxes, would then feel a responsibility. These
it goes on.
Yeah, it goes on. You don't need nearly half the people giving.
Back to Forbes.
People would also have a lot more if you didn't have the inflation tax as well.
Sure, and all regulations. I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can factor into this discussion. And prices are high for a number of reasons, and so if people, if businesses didn't have to put up with government regulations and could be regulated, on a kind of a consensual basis by third-party certifiers and things like that, costs could go down and people would have more money. And of course, if you didn't have to pay money to the federal government, you'd have more money in your pocket with which to choose which charities you give the money to, which is far more efficient, because then the charities are competing to some extent for people's dollars, which is very important.
There are also a lot of very wealthy people today who don't pay any federal income taxes because they
know the loopholes.
They know the loopholes, and they have tax attorneys.
So as the nation marched on, says Forbes, grew wealthier and took a leadership role in the world, it was the philosophy of the North that took root in many instances for the better. We became a country that used its wealth to bear some moral responsibility for those among us that had had it a bit tougher. Now Ron Paul wants our kids to abrogate their responsibilities as Americans. No, that's the entire reverse of what Ron Paul wants. Ron Paul wants young people and everybody else to embrace responsibility. It's the government that wants people to abrogate their responsibilities. It's the government that says, we'll take care of you. You don't have to save for retirement. We'll handle that for you. Just look to us. We'll take care of your kids. You don't have to decide which school to send them to. We'll make that choice for you. You don't need to think about what they'll need to learn. We'll decide what they need to learn. We'll decide what's important, so on and so on. They're constantly taking responsibility away from people. Ron Paul advocates the opposite. Anyway, he encourages them to avoid, this is Forbes again, avoid contributing to the pool that helps other Americans get a better education. The American education system run by the government, it sucks, and it's been getting worse over time, and the money has been increasing over time, so that pool of money going to education has increased while the quality has gone down.
The pool's getting deeper, and your kids are drowning in it.
And that's not because kids are dumber today than they used to be in the past. It's because the system is inefficient, the system is bureaucratic, it is a monopoly or near monopoly system. And to use the term contribute, I think also kind of suggests that, we're just giving, voluntarily into this educational pool. No, we're forced to pay for it. I don't want to pay for these government schools here in Keene, New Hampshire. I don't want to pay for them anywhere, but I'm willing to pay for education. I don't have an objection to the idea of educating young people, even though I don't have kids. I have no objection to the idea of doing so. I would just rather support educational providers that I agree with.
And what about the student loan scam that the government started back in the 70s, which before the student loan program, colleges and universities had to charge what people could afford.
Yeah.
And
now they get them in debt for the most of their adult lives.
Now it's a complete scam. If you look at some of the interviews and some of the information that's come out on the whole student loan program.
There's a bill introduced here in the New Hampshire House with our new libertarian folks that are in the House that says that people's property taxes, people with kids that are not in the public school systems, their property taxes will be diminished as a result. So it's an amazing step forward. This isn't happening in your state, and something to consider.
Well, that hasn't actually happened yet, Mark.
It hasn't happened.
Filed, right?
What other state has been filed in?
It's not a step forward until it actually.
It's not a step forward until you file the bill, man.
Well, that's a step towards actually taking. That's like a baby step towards taking an actual step. But until a bill actually passes, it's just an idea.
The teachers' union will fight that one real hard.
Yeah,
they certainly will. I'm sure they will. But how many other states does that happen in?
I couldn't tell you, Mark. All kinds of people submit bills all over the place, so that's a good question. He asked the younger generation to turn their back on the responsibility to pay into the Social Security system as their parents did before them. See, it happened in the past, so it must happen in the future. I mean, it's always been happening, so therefore it's a good idea. And you have a responsibility. How did that happen?
This guy sounds like a car salesman.
So he goes on to say, so that an even earlier generation can look forward to some financial security in their sunset years. Meaning me, is what he's talking about, right? Ron Paul envisions an America where it is every man and woman for themselves. He does so in the bizarre belief that most of American society could somehow exist as a wholly self-contained family unit in today's highly integrated world. Representative Paul would do well to acknowledge that those days passed us by a very long time ago, and there is no going back. Maybe Paul simply cannot relate to what life is like for those with fewer opportunities than he had. And he goes on to talk about how Ron Paul, in an article written by his wife, where he faced hardships and he learned how to work hard. He says that Ms. Paul goes on to make a pretty big deal over how Ron had a part-time job painting the school during a summer holiday and delivering furniture for a store. She tells us how he made some money in college delivering laundry and how he even delivered mail during Christmas holidays. Oh, the horror of it all, says the Forbes writer. Just imagine having to put newspapers inside the screen doors rather than just throwing them in the yard, and the emotional and physical pain he must have experienced delivering the mail during the Christmas holidays so he could pay his tuition.
Yeah, back then they had to walk like 5 miles in the snow with bare feet.
It's a wonder the man survived, let alone made it to the Congress of the United States. It is possible that the Pauls could just be the tiniest bit out of touch with the difficulties faced by millions of Americans to whom a paper route would represent an idyllic childhood, even if they had to put the papers inside the screen door. Is it possible that Representative Paul views his own experience as a self-sustaining, responsibility-taking American through the prism of suburban life, rather than the experience of the inner-city single mother who works 2 hard jobs just to put food on the table, if she can find a job at all?
Oh, unbelievable, this guy.
Well, I mean, I think that's a legitimate point to make. That Ron Paul
is. The question is, I guess, that, what should we do about people that make bad decisions? First off, I think that there should be an incentive system for not making bad decisions, but making good ones. And I'll tell you that to some extent, this the system that we have today, especially the welfare system, is set up in order to benefit you if you make bad decisions, not if you make good ones. So don't have a husband? Well, you'll get more money. Have some more kids? Well, you'll get more money. These are, this is a system that's set up to make bad decisions. So, yeah, I do want a system that incentivizes good decision making.
Would the single mom that he's talking about have to work 2 jobs if she didn't have a portion of her paycheck stolen from her by the government?
Half of her paycheck taken away from her? I mean, that was one job, right?
Half through inflation.
Or maybe if her kids could work too at younger ages, maybe that would help as well. More coming up. This is Free Talk Live. So just to bring you up to speed, there's one more paragraph in this story, for those of you just tuning in, about this Ron Paul financial crack dealer article from Forbes. And it kind of wraps up what this guy thinks about Ron Paul and what he's doing, which is, of course, promoting an idea of a significant increase in liberty here in the so-called United States. And Rick Unger is the man's name who wrote this article over at Forbes. He writes, what Paul is offering the nation's working youth is financial crack. Enjoy yourself today, but forfeit the benefits government can provide society. Benefits that you might be surprised to find may become a necessity in your own life in the years to come. He encourages the young to put more money in their own pocket today by forgetting about the responsibility this generation owes to their fellow Americans, even when life goes particularly well, allowing for a greater contribution to the public good. Let's hope Donald Trump is right, and that Ron Paul can never be elected President of the United States. I would hate to see what we might become under his sort of leadership.
Justice, it's not about agenda, it's not about mobilizing people, it's about dialing for corporate dollars. These two parties have sold the U.S. government and the American people to the highest bidders.